The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chaya Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hi friends, thank you so much for joining me today for another brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Although in a way, this feels like an episode that has been in the works for a very long time, since around 2022 in fact. Back when I first launched the podcast, I heard about the story of a Jane Doe known as Mary Ellen, whose body had been discovered in the cellar of a house in Greater Manchester. It's the longest standing case on my list of tales to cover, and it reminds me a lot of one of the most impactful stories I've ever shared on the show, the Angel of the Meadow mystery. Just so you're aware, there will be a couple of mentions of domestic violence in this episode, as well as a few slightly grim details, mostly related to human remains. But as always, I'll try my best not to be too graphic. That said, I'm just glad to be able to spread the word about Mary Ellen's story today. So without further delay, let's begin. Just before Christmas in 1982, on the 14th of December, a man named John Baxendale had just moved into a house on Bromwich Street in the Greater Manchester town of Bolton, along with his wife, Wendy. At the time, John was between jobs as a painter and decorator, and when he became the new tenant of the semi-detached house, he took it upon himself to spruce the place up a little. On this day, he and Wendy had taken a trip down into the home's cellar with their Alsatian dogs Sheba and Rebel in tow, and began to clean and tidy the area, which was in desperate need of attention. There was dirt and clutter all around them, and John began to move a few items around in order to see what he was dealing with. In one particular corner, he picked up a cardboard box, and to his surprise, he spotted something incredibly odd beneath it. Thinking at first that it could be part of a plastic dummy figure, he picked up the object to take a closer look. And as he did so, he realized exactly what he was holding in his hands: a real human skull. The skull still contained a pair of false teeth, which is how John deduced that it was likely genuine. He just had a feeling that amongst the rubbish and grime, there may be more remains lying there, waiting to be discovered. And he was correct. Speaking to the Manchester Evening News, he described how he began to clear around through the debris when he located a hand and then the rest of an arm. Nearby, he also came across some additional items of interest, including a pair of trousers, a cardigan, pieces of a bra, and some rosary beads. John knew that he had to report what he had uncovered to the police, and after placing the skull into a bag, he set off to the Castle Street police station to inform the authorities about the sinister findings he had just made in his new home. Even in the busiest of stations, I can imagine that a member of the public bringing in a human skull is still a pretty unusual occurrence. And naturally, the police jumped into action immediately. One of the officers involved in the initial investigation was Rick Armstrong, who has spoken out about some of the details of the case in recent years. He told the BBC that once the police were able to examine the scene, they identified a number of bones, along with certain remains like the hands and arms, which they described as being in a mummified condition. Speaking about the body, Rick said, quote, "It was wrapped as if someone had lain down and rolled over in cardboard and paper to keep themselves warm." And this is an important point to note, as the way in which the remains appeared to be wrapped up seems to form the basis of one of the key theories in this case. The Bromwich Street area of Bolton was once part of what was known as bedsit land, with some of the properties known to have been used by people who were without a permanent home, usually for a short period of time before they moved along. As Rick Armstrong explained, it was speculated that this person was probably a vagrant, or someone who went from town to town and tried to get on someone's settee for a night's sleep. She'd just gone in there, gone to sleep, and never woke up. And as you might have just picked up on, his words gave away one of the key findings of the forensic examination that was eventually carried out on the remains, that the deceased person was found to have been a woman. It was concluded that she had likely been around 40 years old when she passed away. She had been white and had probably stood around 4 feet 10 inches tall, so she was very petite. Analysis of the scene around her also turned up some interesting findings. Alongside the cardboard, the woman was also wrapped in newspaper, and the pages turned out to be from a copy of the News of the World from back in 1966, from the 13th of March to be exact. This means that it's possible her body had been lying there, hidden from view, for around 16 years. Now, at some point during the investigation, the woman was given the nickname of Mary Ellen, and it's the moniker I'm going to be using for her going forward in this story. In the absence of knowing her real identity, I wanted to give her the respect of using a proper name when speaking of her. Now, whilst the police were working on their investigation into what could have happened to Mary Ellen, they also had a second and equally important job to do. They had to figure out who she had been. At the time, in 1982, the techniques and technologies the authorities had access to were much more limited than they are today. It would still be another couple of years before DNA profiling was even properly established, so all they really had to go on were the clues they had before them. In an effort to appeal to the public for information on Mary Ellen's true identity, the police released detailed information about the clothing she had been wearing, as well as the accessories that had been found with her remains. The media were allowed to report that she had been wearing a turquoise jumper, a yellow cardigan, and brown stretchy trousers when she died. And it was also revealed that she had been wearing a number of items of jewelry. These included a gold eternity ring, which she had worn on her left hand, a single gold cross earring, and the black rosary beads. But just like in the Angel of the Meadow case, the descriptions of these personal items of Mary Ellen's prompted no solid leads or tips. There were attempts to trace the origins of the jewelry items, but experts in Birmingham informed detectives that the pieces were mass-produced, so it would be very difficult to pinpoint exactly where they had been purchased from. After a number of months and multiple dead-end inquiries, the police decided that it was time to take advantage of something that was considered incredibly innovative at the time. They set about creating a facial reconstruction to provide a tangible visual of what Mary Ellen may have looked like. This was hugely significant, as it marked the very first time a British police force had used this technique during an investigation. And if you've ever visited the Greater Manchester Police Museum, you may well have seen what they were able to create in this groundbreaking pursuit with your own eyes. A forensic artist named Richard Neve, who was working for the University of Manchester at the time, was given the task of sculpting a likeness of Mary Ellen's face based on what could be deduced from her remains using modelling clay. Recalling this pivotal moment in his career, he said, "I do remember her. She had a wig and eyelashes glued on by a friend of mine who was a makeup artist at a TV company. Not something I'd tend to do now. It wasn't a portrait. It can never be a portrait because I don't know exactly the shape of her chin and the tip of her nose, or whether she had spots, pimples, scars, freckles. So it's not necessarily her face, but it's a face which is broadly similar. The clay figure of Mary Ellen's head is quite striking to look at. Even though some creative license had to be taken, I can see why it was considered a useful tool in the attempts to identify her. The reconstruction was presented to the media in February of 1983, and because of how revolutionary the technique was, it gained a huge amount of attention throughout the country and even resulted in a tip, which we'll talk about shortly. But whilst all of this media buzz was rumbling on around the question of who Mary Ellen had really been, the investigators were still working away in the background on the matter of how she died and what could have caused her premature passing. Mary Ellen's case was actually looked at by a pathologist from the Home Office, who determined that no one else had been involved in her death, as there were no obvious signs of foul play. However, the 1983 inquest into her death recorded an open verdict, which means that the case is officially still a mystery even to this day. But that doesn't mean that the debate around what fate could have befallen Mary Ellen has gone quiet. In fact, it's probably meant that the discussion has remained an active topic of conversation amongst those determined to find out how and why her life ended. It seems to be the belief of many close to the case that Mary Ellen had been without a home of her own, and that the cardboard and newspaper she was wrapped in had been a makeshift bed of sorts. It's theorized that, for whatever reason, she may have taken herself away to the basement, covered herself up with the paper and card for warmth, and passed away quietly with no one even realizing she was there. And of course, we have to consider that this is a real possibility, but many others aren't convinced. One of those who has been vocal about his belief that there must have been foul play involved is Steve Howarth, a former reporter with the Bolton Evening News, who was actually one of the first people on the scene in Bromwich Street back in 1982 covering the story. He has made his opinion on the case very clear by saying, quote, "There was absolutely no way this poor woman crawled in there and just died. Somebody put her there. I'm pretty sure of it. It's all pure speculation, but my gut feeling is that she came to an unfortunate end at the hands of someone else, or possibly as a result of an accidental drug dose. Somebody dumped her in a corner, hoping that nobody would find her, and nobody did for 16 years. And it's easy to understand why Steve might hold a view like this. Mary Ellen's body is often described as being wrapped in newspaper, and whilst it's technically possible that she could have wrapped herself up, if you actually think about individual sheets of newspaper, that process would be very fiddly to do yourself. The cardboard I can get behind. If it was something like a large box that had been opened up, it would be relatively easy to envelop yourself in that. But the newspaper is a weird one for me. Then, of course, there's the enormous matter of the fact that she lay undiscovered for 16 years. Even if the house had previously been used as a bedsit for multiple people living transient lifestyles, I find it hard to believe that during that entire time period, not a single person noticed that a decomposing body was somewhere within the home, even if that place was the cellar. Something doesn't add up for me, and I can absolutely see why some people believe that her body was hidden away in the corner of the basement by someone who knows exactly what caused Mary Ellen's death. It's all very, very strange. Now, sadly, because of the lack of evidence pointing towards the involvement of anyone else in the case, in terms of concluding whether her passing was accidental, natural, or something much more sinister, this is where we reach the end of the road. But that's not to say that the twists and turns in this case were over. Far from it, in fact. And here is where we circle back to the tip I mentioned a moment ago, which came in following the media coverage of the modelling clay reconstruction of Mary Ellen's face. Although I'm not 100% sure exactly when the call was made, whether it was during the media appeal in 1983 or sometime afterwards, we do know that a woman from Liverpool named Lily James felt compelled to contact Greater Manchester Police. After seeing the facial reconstruction, Lily wondered whether Mary Ellen could actually be her missing mother, Ruth Hanratty, who had vanished at some point during the 1960s. Although the timelines would have possibly matched up, in the end it was impossible for the investigators to prove one way or another whether the unknown woman really was Ruth. There was simply not enough information to go on, which must have been unbearably heartbreaking for poor Lily. After doing some digging around, I found an article from the Bolton News, which suggested that Lily had actually contacted the newspaper back in 2004, saying that she remained convinced that Mary Ellen was indeed her missing mum. By this time, there had, of course, been huge advancements made in things like DNA testing, and I can only imagine that Lily was desperate to receive some more thorough and definitive answers in the case. Yet she would have to wait a further 5 years until her request for further answers was responded to, as it wasn't until 2009 that one of the initial investigators, Rick Armstrong, who I mentioned earlier, actually reopened the case and made a bold move in order to make use of these new and promising technologies. Although this occurrence is relatively rare, Rick was actually granted permission to have Mary Ellen's body exhumed. She had spent the past couple of decades buried in an unmarked grave in Bolton's Heaton Cemetery, which really upset me when I heard about it, and is actually something I'm going to make some inquiries about, because it just doesn't seem right to me that there's nothing at her gravesite to memorialize her. But back to the exhumation. Once Mary Ellen was above ground, it became possible to extract a DNA sample from her remains, which could then be tested against Lily's DNA to see if there was a match. Rick Armstrong explained that if enough links could be made between the two women's samples, then they would be able to say with confidence that Mary Ellen was actually Ruth. But sadly for all involved, this wasn't meant to be. The testing confirmed that the remains didn't belong to Lily's mother, which is even more tragic considering how many years she'd held out hope for some kind of closure. I really do feel for her. There was another significant lead that came in too, but again led to no solid answers. A member of the public shared their belief that the unidentified woman was, in truth, a lady named Brenda, who had been a regular patron at the Gypsy Tent pub in Bolton. This tip was sent in to the Bolton News by a woman who had spotted an article about a new missing persons website that had been launched, which featured Mary Ellen's case. She said that she had long suspected that the remains could have been those of Brenda, who had lived in the Blackburn Road area and worked as a machinist, but hadn't come forward with the information sooner, as she thought the case had already been solved. Following the news coverage about Lily James's tip, the informant said that she was 99% sure that the facial reconstruction could have depicted Brenda, and although she didn't know her surname, she claimed that she had had a boyfriend named Ray, and that the pair had spoken about renting a flat together in Bromwich Street. The Missing Persons Bureau confirmed in around 2013 that they had passed the information along to the police, but from what I can find, nothing ever came of it. However, just a few years back, something happened which would add an entirely new dimension to this story, something which reflected the lack of answers in the case, yet provided a glimmer of positivity in a tale that's otherwise so tragic. In 2022, BBC Radio Manchester launched a podcast series dedicated to Mary Ellen's story called The Forgotten Dead. It was a multi-parter which explored numerous angles of the mysterious case, from the journey of trying to identify the unknown woman to the various theories about her fate. And one of those who tuned in to listen was a man who goes by the name of Matthew. After Matthew had listened to the podcast, he had this really strange feeling. Although he described it as a long shot, he thought that Mary Ellen's story sounded like something that could have happened to his mother, who had disappeared without a trace when he was just 3 years old. He made the choice to contact both Greater Manchester Police and the podcast host, Jane Wilkinson, and this one small action prompted an extraordinary chain of events. Matthew's mother had vanished in 1974, so a little later than the date the police believed Mary Ellen could have passed away based on the newspaper. At the time, she had been 27 years old and living in Bolton, caring for Matthew and his 2 siblings, whilst battling with some serious issues in her personal life. She was divorced and had been involved in a relationship with a married man, which was both unhealthy and unsafe. This man was known to be quite violent, and Matthew has spoken about how his mum would hide at his grandmother's home in order to get away from him. As Matthew recalls, one day his mum told him and his siblings that she needed to drop them off at their grandmother's, as she, quote, had the gas man coming round, and after this she completely disappeared. My heart broke for Matthew as I read about his story. He was essentially left without any answers for 50 years. I can't even begin to imagine how difficult this would have been for himself and his siblings too. But after contacting the police about the Mary Ellen case, he would not be waiting for answers for much longer. The investigators decided that Matthew's report had enough potential similarities with this long-standing mystery to be looked into. As they made their inquiries, though, they quickly realized that these similarities were not quite as strong as they had first suspected. The timeline wasn't quite right, and factors like the 2 women's ages and builds didn't match up either. But after taking a DNA sample from Matthew, they decided to continue their investigation, and before long, something unbelievable was discovered. Though Matthew had been so certain for so long that his mother must have met an awful end to her life, the police had some shocking news for him. His mum could not possibly have been Mary Ellen, because she was, in fact, alive. Oh, this really gets me. I have a bit of a lump in my throat. It's such incredible news for Matthew, set against this bittersweet background of this poor lady who still remains unidentified. When Matthew was informed by the police that his mother was safe and well, he understandably experienced a huge and complex mixture of emotions. And although they couldn't pass on her contact details for legal reasons, they were able to pass on a letter that he had written to her. This journey is documented in the early episodes of Series 2 of The Forgotten Dead, and it really is such a beautiful example of why you should never give up hope. Matthew revealed that around 3 months after he wrote to his mum, he received a phone call. And when he heard a distantly familiar voice on the other end, he realized that he was speaking with his long-lost mother for the first time in 5 decades. As the months went on, the pair progressed from a phone call to a video call and were eventually able to meet up face to face, properly reuniting. And I can't even find the words to describe how that must have felt for them both. I can't imagine it. It must have been surreal. Matthew recalls how he simply said, "Hello, Mom," before they shared a big hug and were able to speak about what had taken place back in the early 1970s. His mum revealed that during those years, the situation with the man she was involved with had reached a point of crisis. She had become completely terrified for not only her own life, but the lives of her 3 children. And Matthew said that she made a choice that, in his own words, no mother should ever have to make to escape a violent partner. We have to remember that 50 years ago, there were far fewer resources available to women involved in violent and abusive relationships. And I don't think it would be at all fair to judge her for the actions she took under such terrible circumstances. Matthew learned that after his mum left her 3 sons in the care of family, she proceeded to use a string of false names, working cash-in-hand jobs, and avoiding any kind of official channels that would mean her real identity could be discovered. Although her name has not been revealed for privacy reasons, she has spoken anonymously about certain details of her story, like the fact that after making her escape, she spotted something that had been handwritten on the door of the women's toilets in a cafe, signposting women who had been affected by an abusive partner to a newly founded charity, none other than Women's Aid. This meant that she was able to receive some of the help she needed, and although she did make an attempt to contact her family in the time that followed, this was unsuccessful, and it appears that she had resigned herself to living with the pain of never being able to speak to her loved ones again until she received a phone call from Greater Manchester Police all those years later. Although it hasn't been an easy road, Matthew and his mum have been able to properly reconnect and have had conversations full of forgiveness and understanding, which is incredible to hear. This really is a beautiful thing that has come out of such a sad tale. But as for Mary Ellen, I'm afraid that her story remains unsolved to this day. However, she certainly hasn't been forgotten. I firmly believe that we have not heard the last about her case, and I hope that as things like genetic genealogy techniques continue to evolve and become more widely used, that we may soon have access to the answers that could be hiding somewhere out there in a database. I wanted to end today with a quote from Katie Henderson, a curator at the Greater Manchester Police Museum, where the reconstruction of Mary Ellen's face is still displayed even today. And I think you'll see why. It's really quite moving. Quote, "When you come into the crime room, her case is directly in front of you, so she is one of the first things you see. I think the face looks quite serene. She has a calm expression, as if she is steadily observing everybody, so I do think she draws you in. Often, young children will ask if she is real, and we say she's real in that she was a person who was alive once, but her real name is a mystery. It's something that people always remember." Oh, I just know that this is one of those stories that's going to stick with me forever. When someone has been buried without a name, without their name, it just hits me really deeply and makes me want to do something to try and help. Had you heard about Mary Ellen's story before? What do you make of this case? I still feel that there are so many unknown factors and missing details, and with how much time has passed, I think that's inevitable. But I wanted to play a part in ensuring that her tale continues to be remembered. I was serious about looking deeper into the matter of her unmarked gravesite, so do watch this space for more information if I'm able to get some clarification on this. If there's anything that could be done by way of a memorial, I would love to explore that. But for now, it's time for us to move into our outro section. And if you're a regular listener, you'll know what that means. Let's head on over to Weird Media. Well, after the heaviness of today's story, I'm going to keep things light and funny and silly for Weird Media today because I'm recommending the incredible Amandaland. Now, even though I'm not a mum myself, I have been a long-time fan of Motherland, which is a BBC comedy all about the trials and tribulations of parenthood, with the focus on the parents themselves. It is brilliant. I reckon I've watched the whole lot at least 20 times over. I just adore it. Amandaland is a spin-off of Motherland that follows one of the series' most divisive yet utterly entertaining characters, Amanda, as you may have guessed from the title. Amanda likes the finer things in life, to put it mildly. She's quite spoilt and entitled, yet there's something oddly captivating about her. She's just enthralling to watch. Amanda is played by the amazing Lucy Punch, and the show documents her antics post-Motherland, when she's been forced to move from a more affluent, trendy area of London to one that's more up-and-coming following her divorce, and watching her navigate her new life is just brilliant. There are a couple of familiar faces from Motherland in the show, namely her mum Felicity, played by the brilliant Joanna Lumley, as well as her friend Anne, played by the hilarious Philippa Dunn. But we're treated to some wonderful new characters too, like her neighbour Mal, and parents from her kids' new school like Della, Fee and JJ, who all add so much to the dynamics of the programme. The second series has just been released and I watched it all in about 2 days because I genuinely can't get enough. The millisecond I finished the last episode, my first words were, "I'm already excited to watch it again." It's one of those shows where it's funny on the first viewing, but the more you watch each episode, the more clever little moments you notice, and it just becomes more and more hilarious. If you're a Motherland fan, then definitely jump straight in with Amandaland. But if you've not seen either show, I would start with Motherland first and then go on to Amandaland, because there are some brilliant callbacks and references. Plus, Motherland is wonderful in its own right. Regardless, you're in for a treat. A big thank you for hanging out with me today for this episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Down in the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs and links to all of the sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing our social media pages as well as our email address. If you're listening on Spotify, please feel free to leave us a comment. And you can also get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook or TikTok and tell me all about your thoughts on today's story. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment or two, I'm always hugely appreciative of a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you again for joining me today, and I'll be back next week with another fascinating, strange but true story to tell you. So, until next time, take care of yourself and others, and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.